When Rome defeated a king, death was mercy. What they did to his daughters was far worse. The rope burns where it circles her wrists. It is a simple fact, a thin line of heat and friction, the kind of pain that does not scream but remembers itself with every small movement. Straw presses into the palms where her fingers curl. The animals shift somewhere beyond the partition, the low hummed breath of horses in a smell of dust and old feed. Her sisters are close enough to see the whites of each other's eyes, close enough to touch if hands were not bound, if arms were not pinned by orders that have no concern for tenderness. Cassia counts the snaps in the night that are not thunder, soldiers' boots on packed earth, the flaring of a torch. By training and temperament, she is more used to the arc of ink across a living document, to negotiating the temper of a court, than the blunt tyranny of legions. A Pontic princess by blood and education, she spent her youth learning the languages of statecraft, the careful geometry of alliance. Tonight those languages have narrowed into a single bargaining phrase she will soon speak. I give myself. Let them live. The choice arrives less like a bolt and more like a ledger closing under an invisible hand. To die is to end everything. To live is to carry a ledger for the rest of a life. Rome has taught that a living witness may be useful. But Rome has taught something else far more terrifying. The capacity to erase a future without spilling blood. The older punishments, killings, executions, are blunt instruments. What Rome prefers in this theater is something surgical, the public degradation of daughters so complete that the dynasty collapses like a roof under a sustained, remorseless rain. The girls would breathe. They would not marry, they would not bear legitimate heirs. The line would end with quiet, unremarked inevitability. For a general who fights kingdoms, extinction of lineage is the longer victory. There are sounds now, whispers from the stable's far end, the hush of a soldier's inspection, and a voice that belongs to General Kraus, clipped and clinical. He speaks of necessity, and the language of necessity is the official instrument of empire. Political theater, the general might have said in other contexts. Here he says something more precise, a calculus, public spectacle to demonstrate dominance, logistics that favor display over execution, a symbolic annihilation of a house's future. For commanders like him, an image of a defeated line humiliated before the world secures control as surely as victory in battle. Cassia's mind moves in those cold folds. She thinks of heirs not as future children alone, but as claims, as banners, as reasons for men to keep fighting. She thinks of Leodice, steady, quick to laugh, older by a few years, and already scanned by Rome's curiosity to see which habits of court she might bring. She thinks of Nyssa, small and fierce, and always humming some song under her breath, the one who can coax ataraxia out of a house cat or a grieving mother. They are three women reduced to the same single problem the empire sees: the potential of a body to continue a line that contradicts Roman hegemony. The stable is colder than Cassia expects, not because of weather, but because purpose chills a place more efficiently than winter. Soldiers move in that way, trained to remove any softness from the immediate world. Their faces are not monsters. They are functionaries with hands that memorize orders. General Kraus paces in the lantern light, his silhouette a rectangle of authority. He explains the punishment with the clinical detachment of a man who has translated cruelty into policy. He uses the word that will come to run through every official report: deterrence. The spectacle is deterrence incarnate, an argument told in humiliation, a lesson for any who might inherit a throne and imagine they can keep it intact. We should say plainly, before the story pushes further into the things it must describe, that what follows includes reference to sexualized public degradation as a tool of power. I will not offer lurid detail or scenes meant to titillate. Instead, the account will treat those acts as a brutal instrument of statecraft. Their purpose is political and psychological, rather than private. Some scenes are dramatized, reconstructed from practices attested in fragmentary sources and from reasonable inference about how commanders used spectacle. Where the historical record is unclear, the narrative leans on plausible reconstruction rather than definitive claim. Cassia remembers the first time she heard the Roman word for triumph. In the palace halls it was spoken like a charm against defeat. Images of captured kings, of spoils, of slaves paraded beneath roaring crowds. But triumphs were not just parades of booty. They were proofs of order. They converted violence into meaning. To be put on display inside a triumph, or to have one's female kin made into the spectacle that equaled defeat, was to be erased in a particular way. A dead king might later inspire revolt. A living woman stripped of future legitimacy breaks lines with cleaner economy. The historian in Cassia thinks of economies, of the efficiency of a punishment that preserves the army's labor force and yet extinguishes political continuity, and of the cruelty that counts lives as units of value. General Kraus believes he is being merciful. History will not record mercy when it is a strategic choice, but the men who implement policy often soften their language until it becomes doctrine. We do not need martyrs, Kraus says. We need peaceable endings. It is exacting, the way empire uses euphemism to erase the moral contours of what it asks prostrate bodies to endure. Cassia hears it as what it is, the logic of an occupying power deciding to trade trauma for erasure. She has been taught rhetoric and the arithmetic of alliances. When the camp commander first brings the proposition, she reduces it to terms she can manage. She calculates outcome probabilities with the dry calm of someone who has read treaties, letters, and the subtleties of persuasion. The alternatives line up in her mind. Resistance with the likely consequence of summary executions for all. Submission with survival, but under domination. Or a third, most perilous option, trade herself for her sisters. To step forward would mean to resign dignity, to accept a role in Rome's public theater of humiliation, but it would also, she reasons, offer the best chance for Laodice and Nyssa to claim anything resembling life after defeat. When she speaks, it is not with pleading, but with the firmness of accounting. Allow my sisters to live, she says, and I will present what I know of Pontus's remaining dispositions. I will offer names, routes, alliances. If you must humiliate, let it be me. There is an economy even in the phrasing. Cassandra, Cassia, has learned that to give information is to become a resource. Soldiers and officers are, by inclination, collectors of use. A living informant is a commodity that can be spent for later advantage. Cassia does not like that word, commodity, but she understands its functionality. General Kraus studies her. He is not cruel for cruelty's sake. Cruelty is an instrument he prefers shaped by theory. He sees her as a possible lever. He recognizes the political profit. By allowing one princess to be used as a cautionary exemplar, he can remove the future threat the line represents and later present a pacified region to Rome's capital, a clean narrative useful in the Senate chambers. For Kraus, a living Cassia who will provide intelligence is worth more than 3 dead ones, whose corpses might inspire sympathy abroad or give rise to stubborn myths of martyrdom. The calculation is both cold and cunning. But ambition circulates in the camp like wind in the eaves. Marcus Antonius Priscus is a younger officer, a tribune whose sense of future status is sharper than his loyalty to any particular general. Where Kraus thinks in terms of policy, Priscus thinks in terms of career. He approaches the situation like a man who sees reputation as capital. If Kraus will be remembered as the general who ended a threat, Priscus wants the credit of the intelligence that secures victory. He steps into the discussion with the sort of smoothness cultivated by officers who understand that once a story goes to Rome, the teller's name often matters as much as the facts. Priscus proposes a compromise that is both practical and self-serving. Delay the public spectacle, he says, at least until he can reap the political rewards of the intelligence Cassia seems willing to provide. He frames it in the language of prudence. Useful intelligence is better than an immediate demonstration of force, and he pitches a plan to keep this useful witness in officer quarters under watchful supervision, where her knowledge can be extracted slowly and placed as props in the narrative he will present to the Senate. In doing so, he reconfigures Cassia's possible roles. She becomes not only spectacle, but instrument, source, and symbol. This is where the narrative bends. The bargain shifts the scene from immediate humiliation to a longer, more complex form of captivity. Cassia understands, sharp and exact as any strategist, that to keep her sisters alive will require not merely one exchange, but continual measured deliverables. She will need to offer information that is credible enough to keep Priscus interested, but never so complete as to render herself useless. In that space of calculation, she sees a narrow corridor of power. Information becomes her currency. Delay becomes her shield. Proximity to the men in power becomes both threat and possibility. The caravan that escorted the defeated royal household has been converted into a theater of sorts. Tents become offices where maps are spread on low tables. Ink-stained fingers point to routes and depots. Translators murmur in borrowed dialects. The officers like to think in maps, lines drawn, moves plotted. Cassia watches them place pins representing towns and fortifications, listening for the way their mouths frame the contours of her country. She speaks with care, offering fragments calibrated to built-in skepticism. She knows the names the Romans value: ports, supply lines, the names of those who would not easily bend again. She speaks not only to deliver usable intelligence, but to control what she gives away, to create a reputation for usefulness that might keep her sisters off the rope. There is a craft to lying truthfully. Cassia invents where she must, omits where she must, and supplies roots of truth where necessary. Her accounts are often true in outline. She will not easily fabricate the names of long-standing allies because they are too easy to refute. Instead, she supplies lesser-known safe harbors and plausible detours that the Romans find valuable. Sometimes she steals truth from rumor and dresses it as certainty. Each bit of information is priced: favors, movements of soldiers, small concessions, until the circle around her tightens into a peculiar kind of kinship with the men who hold her captive. Priscus, for his part, is not unkind in a human sense. He is ambitious and occasionally curious. He has a mind that likes the thrill of a good strategic puzzle. He treats Cassia with a professional curiosity that often passes as civility in a camp designed to erase human empathy. He asks questions about alliances, about marriages, about the small courtesies between noble houses that can point to larger loyalties. He is not above flattery. He sees a career notch in being the officer for whom a princess becomes an informant. There is, too, a pragmatic streak. His patrons in Rome will want names they can use, and better names mean better trophies to present in an aftermath memorandum. That is how Cassia finds herself folded into a new household, in a tent closer to the officer's pavilion than the palace stables. It is not exactly comfort, it is surveillance softened by better food and the constant hum of scheming. There is a strange consolation in the ability to hear again the spoken name of Leodice without it being followed by the screech of an order. She can see her sisters from across the courtyard now and arrange for small mercies. Extra blankets, a sheet of paper with an image of a singer's tune she thinks will please Nisa, a stolen plate of figs. These gestures are almost obscene in their modesty, next to the debt she pays each night. Cassia's bargaining is not only transactional, it is also performative. She plays the part the Romans expect of a defeated noblewoman, submissive when necessary, witty when it serves her purpose, educated enough to be useful in translation, but not so foreign as to be unassimilable. The performance costs her part of herself. Pride, privacy, the capacity to refuse. Concessions accrue, so small at first they feel like survival, and then so large that weeks and months later, she cannot remember what she once valued, without wondering which instincts belong to her and which have been trained into her by necessity. Yet survival begets soft power. Cassia learns the names of Roman officers' wives who correspond with each other across campaigns. She reads official dispatches when officers leave them unattended. She passes along a tactical detail here, a caution there, always imagining her sisters' faces receiving the invisible warmth of normalcy. Leodice begins arranging her speech to new acquaintances in the city, as if her future will be suggested by the right Roman patron. Nisa practices her music in a corner and steals looks at Cassia, mating tunes to hope. The sisters' small acts of living become the quiet proof that a dynasty need not end at the instant of defeat, provided one body is sacrificed to secure the necessary space. This is not a peaceful process. Cassia has nightmares of the rope and the straw, images that do not care whether she has negotiated well. The mind remembers differently than the world records. The camp, in its bureaucracy, is indifferent to what is remembered. It cares only for what can be repurposed. Cassia's memories are now a private ledger that accrues interest and debt, and she is the only clerk capable of balancing it. Priscus watches the effects of her intelligence with a mind that catalogues usefulness. He files away the details Cassia offers and plans how to present them. In his letters home, he will hint at an informant of rare insight. In his speeches, he will use the details to project competence. He understands political theater as much as Kraus, but he sees his gain in the narratives he can later tell in senatorial salons and among Rome's ambitious circles. What fascinates him is not merely the content Cassia gives, but the suggestion that she might become a long-term tool, a living bridge between Rome and a subdued Pontus. The Roman officers are also practical men. They have seen that in late empire, survival can turn into patronage. Captive noblewomen have, in other cases, been folded into elite households as clients or adoptive dependents, their knowledge and connections converted into social capital. A woman like Cassia, literate and politically experienced, has value beyond the immediate. She could advise, translate, or serve as a living document of the defeated regime. The appetite for such usefulness leads to a peculiar institutional logic. Protect the useful captive, degrade the useless one. The rope is not, for them, the universal answer. It is a tool to be applied selectively when strategic optics demand it. For Cassia, that calculus is both a mercy and a prison. She is spared the spectacle in the immediate sense, but she enters a longer, quieter kind of performance where every conversation may be an interrogation, every kindness a bribe, every compliment a recorded advantage. She learns to listen for the telltale rhythms in officers' speeches, what they value, what they fear. She stores small facts about governors and letters about supply chains in her head, turning memory into currency. There is a scene in which Cassia sits across from an aging centurion who, unlike his younger colleagues, talks more of duty than advancement. He is patient in a way that is not often rewarded in the camp. He asks her not about maps, but about rites, about how Pontic households remember their dead, about certain songs one sings when a daughter is betrothed. She answers, and, in the manner of those who have been scholars of empire and of court, senses another kind of negotiation beginning. Cultural exchange as soft power. The centurion will tell this to another officer. It will become a gossip that eventually leads to a proposal to introduce Nisa's music to a Roman household. The small kindness, the centurion's curiosity, plants a seed of patronage that might later bloom into adoption or protection. This is how the social logic of the empire works. It converts suffering into networks. Patronage, adoption, the transformation of captive women into clients. These are routes to survival. They are also routes to erasure. A captured princess who becomes a household's client is safe, but her identity shifts into Roman legal categories. She becomes an artifact in the household ledger, perhaps adopted, perhaps married off in a minor alliance, perhaps remembered only as the woman who served a senator's family. Such survival is double-edged. It preserves life, but often at the cost of lineage and autonomy the defeated household once held dear. All these calculations, Kraus's strategy, Priscus's ambition, the officer's pragmatism, are built on a premise historians return to again and again, that Roman power often preferred symbolic annihilation to outright extermination. The celebration of victory in a triumph was not merely the display of arms. It was a performance that sought to make conquest legible, to convert defeat into a vocabulary of proper order. Women were crucial to that work precisely because lineal continuity can flow through them. To neutralize daughters was to interrupt not just births, but the possibility of claims, alliances, and future conflicts. And yet the record is uneven. What survives in the official histories is often the language of generals and senators. The private economies of survival, the bargains struck in stables and tents, are mostly absent and often must be reconstructed from the faintest traces. If you want more hidden histories like this, subscribe. The bargain continues. Cassia's first deliveries are small and carefully measured. Names of traders who keep provisions afloat in bad weather, the routes favored at night when patrols thin, the likely loyalties of nobles who have lost face but not interest in return. The returns are immediate. A legion diverts to cut off a supply line. A commander secures a minor victory that will later be used in a dispatch to the Senate. Priscus takes notes and feels the glow of credit beginning to gather around him. Kraus nods and keeps his larger design intact. He likes that the immediate need for spectacle can be deferred and hence recalibrated to suit political winds. Months stretch, and Cassia learns the rhythms of a tented life, the cadence of others' preoccupations, the way men's ambitions overlay the quiet days with a kind of gossip that curves into decision. She develops rituals that help her keep the ledger of herself intact. A morning when she counts the names of her sisters aloud and gives thanks. A secret mark she leaves on a piece of cloth that she will one day return to them as a signal that memory remains. A tune she hums when the night is most thin. These rituals are tiny rebellions against the steady amputation of identity. They are also, paradoxically, the things that allow her to continue supplying what the Romans want. Priscus grows in influence as his reports accumulate weight. He is granted leave to return to Rome on occasion with dispatched intelligence, and he learns how to fashion a narrative around the details he receives. He writes letters that mention an insightful correspondent whose knowledge seems to have shortened campaigns. It is the right phrase for a culture that favors the polished anecdote. His senators read it and nod. The credit accumulates for him in the forums and the corridors of patronage. For Cassia, the accumulation is less abstract. Each letter Riscus sends is a promise of continued protection, a trade settled by distance. He is a man fairly represented as complicated, capable of kindness in conversation, patient in interrogation, but always attuned to where his advantage improves. Within the camp there are also quieter, more intimate maneuvers towards safety. Senator Marcus Caecilius Rufus learns of a captive princess of value and sees in her not a thing to be punished, but a woman who could, under his roof, become an asset to his standing in the capital. He offers a sheltered place in his household on the understanding that her presence can enhance his own political narrative, proof that he knows how to assimilate former enemies into the Roman order. It is not humanitarian impulse that guides him, but patronage logic. Yet for Cassia, a patron can mean provisions, legal protection, and crucially, the possibility of arranging new statuses for Leodice and Nyssa. The years that follow should be described with a historian's care. Patterns of adoption and patronage are well attested as routes by which imperial systems absorbed the elites of conquered places. Women like Cassia, when useful and adaptable, could move from being spectacle in waiting to being household dependents, clients, or adoptive wards. Their identities would often be reclassified within Roman legal frameworks. Their lives might be preserved, but their claims reconfigured. Such transformations were a form of survival that required ongoing exchange, of knowledge, of cultural capital, of complicity. Cassia accepts the cost. She sizes it, measures it against the alternative, and finds the price palatable compared to the immediacy of Leodice and Nyssa's safety. Yet even as she succeeds in securing small mercies, there is grief that accumulates like sediment. She watches the world of the palace recede into a geography of memory. The curve of her mother's hand at a tea ceremony, the scent of citrus in a courtyard during spring festivals, a particular rug whose pattern meant a family's genealogy. These are not things one can sell for protection. They remain in her, sometimes amplifying into sorrow, sometimes becoming fuel for the acts of negotiation she continues to perform. Survival requires both sacrifice and a resource of forgetfulness. She must not, at every moment, feel the weight of what has been surrendered. Survival also requires demonstration. The Romans, and empire more generally, value change in visible forms. Leodice, after being housed with a Roman patron who sees advantage in her education and manners, is offered a kind of civil integration, a public adoption into a household that carries the modest but irreversible legal markers of Roman citizenship. It is a complicated victory. Adoption ends one legal identity and creates another. For Leodice, it means safety and prospects that her homeland could no longer offer. For Cassia, it is both relief and quiet mourning. Her sister will not be a Pontic princess in the way she once was, but she will live. Nyssa, admired for her musical talent, finds entry into private gatherings where her singing charms the daughters of officers. Music proves, in the Roman mind, a passport as effective as a letter of recommendation. All of these transformations, adoption, patronage, artistic integration, are forms of life reclaimed but reconstituted under Roman terms. The daughters survive the immediate threat. They do not all survive the longer erosion of status without cost. They learn new names. They wear garments that signal their new positions. They learn to speak in the rhythm of a different court. Each small achievement is also the erasure of a larger claim. Imperial power is not content merely to win battle. It reshapes memory. Cassia watches these changes with mixed feelings. There is the pragmatic satisfaction of seeing her sisters secure some kind of future. There is also a primal mourning. She is the architect of that transition, and architects often must live with the knowledge of what their buildings displace. She will never have a marriage arranged by her own people. Her life is a ledger of bargains and valuations. Yet within these constraints she also discovers a different kind of agency. The ability to place a patron, to call on a centurion for a favor, to request a token of freedom. These are soft levers that women in Roman society could use, and Cassia becomes adept at them. Priscus continues to rise. His reports grow in stature. The letters he sends to Rome are read by men whose decisions shape careers and cities. His voice in these dispatches is the voice of someone who has seen the work of a camp through to its end. He uses Cassia's intelligence as his stepping stone, and in doing so, he attaches a human story to his political narrative. This is where the moral ambiguity of the arrangement becomes visible. Cassia's sacrifices produce Priscus's success, and his success guarantees her protection. The calculus is not neat. It is full of moral tannins. On a night when the wind carries a sharp promise of coming frost, Cassia sits alone with a sheet of papyrus and a broken reed. She writes names she will later not disclose in public, names of allies who have fled to the mountains, the marker stones of small refuges, the timekeepers who remember when supply lines cross. She writes to keep track of what she has told and what she has withheld. Memory is her tool, secrecy her shield. The tent around her is full of muted sounds. A dog's snore, the distant laugh of soldiers who do not know what it costs to wake with fear. She folds the papyrus and hides it in a seam of her garment. The act is private, an assertion that some parts of her life remain hers. The camp, for all its bureaucracy, is greedy for results. When Cassia's intelligence helps a small legion intercept a supply caravan, the ripple effect is immediate. Priscus boasts and is rewarded with a minor promotion. Kraus notes the advantage and considers recalibrating his plans for the region. The Senate will later receive a dispatch that reads like a tidy paragraph of military competence. For Cassia, this is a currency exchange that buys a few more days of her sister's safety. It also deepens the network of obligation that binds her to the Romans. The tented life reinforces a grim truth. Empire's victory is as much performed in mundane acts, letters, reports, music recitals, as it is in the clatter of battle. The transformation of captives into clients is an institutional design meant to stabilize conquest. Cassia understands that her personal bargain is a tiny instance of that larger mechanism. She also understands that the mechanism depends on human agents willing either to comply or to exploit the compliance. She has chosen to comply strategically, to place her body and future as the variable that preserves the lives of those she loves. There are nights when Leodice leans her head against Cassia's shoulder, and they talk in the low language of sisters, speaking of a future that is no longer recognizable, yet somehow feels manageable. Nisa hums beneath a blanket, stringing a tune that borrows from both Pontic and Roman songs. These small intimacies are proof that something remains of who they were. Yet now and then, Cassia wakes sweating, certain that some soldier's voice will call for her with a rope in his hand. The terrible theater that was the original threat never entirely disappears. It hangs like a possibility in the air, a shadow that can be made real if political winds shift. It is precisely this potential for reversal that makes Cassia's bargain precarious. She knows Rome's calculations can change. A new commander might view public humiliation as politically expedient after all. A jealous officer might see an opportunity to cut Priscus down by forcing a spectacular punishment. A senator might demand immediate proof of dominance for reasons unrelated to the local strategy. Therefore, she works not only to provide intelligence, but to entangle herself with patrons whose interests align with her sister's safety. Patronage becomes a protective lattice. It is slow to build and maddeningly brittle, but in a system of shifting loyalties, even brittle structures can hold. One evening, an officer arrives with a small gift from a Roman household. A ring with a stone inlaid, its quality modest, but its meaning significant. It is an emblem of favor, a sign that a household recognizes Cassia as someone worth aiding. She accepts it with the practiced gratitude of someone who knows tokens often precede deeper obligations. The ring's metal is warm against her skin. She tucks it into the hidden seam where she keeps the papyrus. Such tokens become part of the language by which she and others navigate captivity. And yet, despite these small accommodations, Cassia has not relinquished the larger aim that shaped her original bargain. To see her sisters live with prospects they would not have had otherwise, and to ensure that the political life of Pontus does not resume with the water of its future spilt. She is a steward of memory and possibility, a constrained kind of patriot who protects not territory, but the lives that might carry the memory of that territory forward in altered form. The winter thaws into a hesitant spring. Within camp there is talk that Priscus may soon be posted to a higher command. His patrons in Rome smile upon him. Rumors circulate that Kraus is being considered for a triumph in the capital, an honor that would require proof of pacified regions and stabilized families. In the background of these announcements, the question that underlines everything persists. When, if at all, will the spectacle be resumed? The rope is a possibility as much as a thing that has already occurred. The calculus that delayed it is as fragile as the fortunes of those who delayed it. Cassia prepares for the contingency as she would for a siege. She trains herself to speak truth in measured pieces, to conceal what might be used to harm her sisters, to create plausible deniability when necessary. She makes a mental map of which Roman officers might be swayed by appeals to decency and which respond only to the price of information. There is no heroic resistance here, only a daily maintenance of strategic prudence. On a morning when the light is pale and the camp moves with its usual lethargic efficiency, a new set of orders arrives. They are in Priscus's hand before Kraus sees them, and the look on the young tribune's face is a mixture of triumph and apprehension. The orders concern a small flanking maneuver in a border town, a chance to test the information Cassia has supplied. Most importantly to Priscus, they carry a clause that reads like a potential ticket to Rome's notice. Act decisively and provide proof of a secure region, and formal commendation will likely follow. For Cassia, the orders are both a sign that her bargaining has shaped real outcomes and a hazard. If the maneuver succeeds, Priscus will be elevated, and the network that protects her and her sisters will be strengthened. If it fails, or if Priscus chooses to demonstrate dominance more publicly, the spectacle she escaped may be returned to her. Her hands feel the old memory of rope. The straw's scent slides into her dreams with the chill of winter. She touches the seam where she keeps her papyrus and ring, and thinks of the arithmetic of survival that led to this point. As the camp prepares to move, Cassia is summoned to a tent that feels different from the others. It is furnished with maps that have seen this season's campaigns, and with a table that holds the kind of ink-stained dispatches that will later become the material of decades-long debates in Rome. Priscus is there, his expression set in professional neutrality. Kraus arrives with the slow certainty of a man whose decisions ripple outward. The air between them is taut with the knowledge that their next moves will shape not just a battle, but the lives tied to it. Cassia stands and chooses her posture. She will continue to make herself useful, but she will also measure each concession against the life of the sisters she seeks to preserve. Her bargain has bought time. Time is now fastened to an uncertain outcome. She breathes in the dust and oil-scented air of the tent and prepares to answer the questions that will define the camp's next actions. The line where her wrists burned has closed into a scar she can touch in the dark. It is both reminder and map. She steps forward and begins to speak. She speaks, and the tent listens. Her voice is quieter than the clatter outside, but every word carries a measured weight. She traces a route with inkless fingers, a narrow coastal pass used by fishermen when storms come early. a monastery of cedars that hides carts at dusk. The name of a town whose magistrate still remembers an old oath. She does not speak all she knows, she cannot afford to. But she places enough true anchors so that men with maps can draw lines and imagine certainty where once there was fog. The maneuver is set. Soldiers break camp with the mechanical patience of long-practiced crews. Standards flutter, horses stamp, wagons creak. Cassia watches them go, wrapped in a cloak that has become both shield and uniform of her new life. The camp recedes like a small world she used to inhabit. The motion carries with it the same mixture of hope and fear that has accompanied every step since she first offered herself. Orders bellow, trumpets sound, a column departs, proof in motion of the currency she'd been paid to mint. What happens next will look, in the dispatches sent north to Rome, like the tidy arithmetic empire's favor. Intelligence leads to interception. Interception leads to a captured convoy. A captured convoy resolves supply problems and proves the genius of a strategy. Priscus will make sure the story reads that way. He will present a map that lines up with the Senate's appetite for clear victories. He will mention an insightful correspondent whose contributions were indispensable. He will not be coy about his role as the officer who turned knowledge into triumph. In the capital, men love the narratives that make them feel both clever and virtuous. Priscus fashions himself precisely in that mold. For Cassia, the immediate result is less abstract. Word returns in fragments, a courier, a folded note, a soldier who smiles once and then looks away. The caravan has been intercepted. Certain roads are now impassable. A small group of dissidents is contained. The network of protection around her swells. Favor begets favor. Priscus receives commendations. Kraus allows himself the distant pride of a plan unfolding. The rope that hung like a threat begins to shrink in the map of possible futures. Yet threats travel as efficiently as favors. With success comes opportunity, and opportunity tempts men who seek to convert advantage into spectacle. Rumors run through the camp that Kraus might indeed receive the honor of a triumph back in Rome, a ceremonial return that would require images of pacified regions and families rearranged into the narrative Rome prefers. The idea of a triumph floats in the air like a challenge. To demonstrate total victory is to offer the Roman public a neat story of domination where potential resistance is visibly erased. Cassia understands the architecture of such a moment. A triumph is not merely parade, it is pedagogy in motion. It teaches each spectator the shape of power by putting before them what must be feared and what must be admired. To be included in that pedagogy, whether as spoils of war, witnesses, or examples, can mean a renewed chance at erasure. She cannot rely on the good sense of others not to trade her life for their political theater. So she continues the work she knows best, shaping narratives, trading fragments of truth for protection, building loyalty slowly as some women stitch fabric into a new dress. When the successful maneuver is reported and Priscus's star brightens, he does not forget who lent him that light. He uses his new advantage as men of patronage do, to secure the people who have been useful to him. He presses his acquaintances in Rome. He speaks with those whose votes and favors matter. And he begins to attach Cassia's name, always obliquely, to his rising profile. This is not magnanimity in a vacuous sense. It is political calculation. He attaches a silk ribbon of obligation to her and to her sisters, the kind that later generations might call patronage. Senator Marcus Caecilius Rufus is a man for whom the presence of a story is as valuable as the presence of a body. He hears of a refined captive who understands the administrative geography of Pontus and the small rituals that bind its households. He imagines correctly that such a woman could enhance his household's reputation in a city that prizes the exotic in manageable doses. He extends an invitation, not phrased as a favor but as an opportunity, offering a sheltered place within his domus for one who can serve both as ornament and counsel. He will call it hospitality. Cassia will read it as a lifeline. The passage to Rome is a slow contraction of world and memory. Tents and fields are replaced by a caravan, then by stately river barges that slide through low light between tree-lined banks. The smells change. Straw and horseflesh give way to smoke and the faint, pungent perfumes of the capital. For Cassia, the travel is another calculation. Each city she passes through provides new opportunities for the chain of protection to lengthen. Each crowded market is also a reminder that any advantage might be undone by a whim or a change of administration. When they finally arrive in Rome, it is both beautiful and hostile in a way that keeps her always translating. The city is an organism that consumes stories and spits out trophies. The domus of Senator Rufus is quiet by contrast. Shaded atrium, cooled marble, servants who move with a choreography learned in decades. He presents Cassia not as a spectacle, but as a guest, more useful and therefore less dangerous when domesticated. In public, he praises her education and temper. In private, he explains with a senatorial wink how her presence will enhance his standing. His offer is transactional but stable. Cassia accepts. It is in Rome that the first major reconfiguration of the sisters' lives occurs. Leodice is taken into the senator's household and slowly introduced into the city's social calendar. She is shown how to sit in Roman gatherings, how to supply conversation that mixes praise with half-hidden knowledge of provincial customs. At some point, the legal instrument of adoption is introduced, not as a brutal erasure, but as a means of survival. Adoption into a Roman patron's household confers protections, a new civic identity, and a place in the city's ledger. The act is not purely charitable, it is an assimilation whose terms are Roman. For Leodice, it is safety with a cost, the slow rebranding of a person into a citizen under another name and another allegiance. Nyssa finds a different path. Her music, once a private consolation hum between sisters, becomes a currency in its own right. In Rufus's house, she sings in small circles, daughters of senators, freedwomen who carry taste like currency, guest musicians who move in networks of influence. Her voice is described, in those later letters Priscus will send home, as exquisite, with a minor melancholic hue, which says more about what audiences wanted to hear than about the woman herself. Music buys Nyssa a niche. She is invited into households as an entertainer. Patrons who appreciate the exotic and the cultivated offer her garments, training, and the chance to make a name for herself in music circles. Over time, she becomes known in certain salons, a name associated with cross-cultural melodies. The life is constrained, but it gives her a public and an income and small authority over the terms of her performances. Cassia remains the hinge around which these transformations turn. In Rufus's house, she is neither free nor entirely captive. She is an advisor in miniature, consulted on matters of provincial custom, translation, and the delicate politics of intermarriage. Her counsel is valued precisely because it is practical and because it speaks to the management of newly integrated elites. She sits at tables where men sketch alliances and decode the loyalties of far-off provinces. She hears praises that sometimes thinly mask gratitude for lives spared. She also hears men, senators, wealthy patrons, retired officers, discuss policy as if they never held a woman's hand under duress. In these rooms, political choices are divorced from the tactile consequences they visit upon bodies. There is an irony to the way Cassia's life unfolds. She negotiates power from the margin, using the knowledge and soft influence available to her. Her bargaining did not stop when she left the camp. It shifted medium. Letters became leverage, favors became pledges, musical performances became introductions for her sisters. She trades with finesse. She offers cultural knowledge to Rufus, arranges for Leodice to meet a household that will value her discipline, oversees Nyssa's musical instruction, and at times negotiates the terms of her own daily life. She finds a strange kind of sovereignty in these acts, a tactical use of the very systems that shaped her captivity. History helps explain why the Romans behaved in this way. Empire prefers instruments that stabilize conquest while minimizing revolt. Public executions can create martyrs and mythic resistance. Public degradations, ones that render future claims impossible, are a cleaner form of political sterilization. Incorporation via patronage, adoption, and household service folds elites into the dominant structure while recasting their identities in Roman legal and social terms. Women, in particular, become vectors for either continuity or erasure because lineage often flows visibly through them in marriage and childbearing. By redirecting their futures into Roman households, empire neutralizes competing dynastic claims without the awkwardness of mass bloodshed. Cassia watches these mechanisms in practice and uses what tools they grant. She arranges introductions for Leodice with families likely to appreciate her learning. She sends Nisa to rehearsals with teachers who have connections. She keeps a ledger in her mind of who owes favors and who might be convinced to press a petition if a danger arises. It is relentless, painstaking work, bureaucracy as survival. And yet, even as she wins small battles for her sisters, she senses the shape of her own losses. Citizenship for Leodice arrives not only as safety, but as a new set of legal assumptions that pull identity toward Roman norms. Nisa's music offers her a public, but also a role that audiences will always look upon with a gentle exoticism. The sisters live, the dynasty does not. Priscus's career continues to ascend. He is granted minor magistracies, then larger commands. Senators he flattered in dispatches remember him kindly. In Rome, he moves in circles where his name is linked to competence and prudence. He does not forget Cassia in his speeches. He mentions the correspondent in official terms when it suits him. And he also cultivates friendships with men like Rufus, who can anchor Cassia's safety within the system that elevated him. The tangled reciprocity is inevitable and, from Cassia's point of view, necessary. Years pass in rhythms that make memory both a refuge and a wound. Cassia ages into a woman whose face carries the small creases of a life spent balancing gratitude and grief. She never remarries. The life she might have had, one arranged within the circles of her own people, with children who might have carried the name of Pontus forward, becomes not a possibility, but a ghost. The sisters speak of such things sometimes in low tones, as if rehearsing a language they once knew. Leodice mentions a pattern on a rug from home and weeps for a day at the window. Nisa writes songs that mix Pontic scales with Roman lyric forms and finds applause in rooms that once would have rejected her kind. Cassia develops habits to keep identity anchored. She keeps the seam where she stored papyrus and ring. She preserves a scent on a strip of cloth that reminds her of a courtyard in her former life. She rehearses a genealogy in her head and corrects herself when Roman names intrude. These are private acts of preservation, tactics for surviving the erosion. They matter because for all the legal and social forms that protect a woman in Roman households, memory remains the last ungovernable thing. There are visits to the forum, to the theaters where dramas turn politics into spectacle, to salons where philosophy and scandal form a continuous hum. In these places, Cassia learns to read power when it is disguised as conversation. She uses epistolary threads to remind Priscus of obligations. She calls on Rufus's house staff to intercede when small injustices arise. At times, a centurion she once spoke to in the camp will appear as a guard outside a forum and offer a bowed greeting, indications that connections once made persist in unexpected ways. Patronage weaves through a society like a subterranean river. Anyone wise in its currents can keep a life afloat. Cassia becomes wise. Still, there are moments when the past intrudes with clean, brutal clarity. News arrives occasionally of other camps, of other families, where the rope was not spared. Reports in Rome speak of commanders who used spectacle when politics demanded a startling proof of dominance. The language in the dispatches is the same: deterrence, necessity, order. But when survivors speak in quieter rooms, they tell a different story, about women whose futures were extinguished not by blade, but by a legal and social sterilization that made claim impossible. These narratives reach Cassia like a cold wind. She recognizes that her sacrifice was not, in a moral sense, preferable to death. It was simply a different form of survival, with consequences that ripple through generations. Time softens the sharp edges of politics, but not the tracings of cost. Priscus, now a man of higher standing, does what patrons do for those who helped him. He presses for formal recognition of Cassia's service. He argues in private letters that her knowledge saved campaigns, that she has been useful to Rome, that she deserves a legal status that reflects her service. Whether by Priscus's urging, by Rufus's quiet pressure, or by a combination of both, a proposal is introduced in the Senate. A petition for her freedom, an official acknowledgement that allows her to be legally released from the quasi-dependence of household custody. The language of the proposal is careful. So too must be the case they make. Freedom for a woman like Cassia is politically legible if framed as reward for service. It is important to say, plainly and with the caution history demands, that the particulars of such an enactment are reconstructed here from the way Roman patronage and manumission often functioned. Records are sparse, the mechanisms varied with context. But it is historically plausible, given Priscus's rising profile and the known uses of patronage, that a woman who had provided enduring service might secure a formal change in status through senatorial favor. Cassia does not gain independence in some glorious reversal. She gains legal recognition that makes certain forms of autonomy possible. The ability to move with fewer formal restrictions, the legal capacity to enter contracts, and the social space to assert herself as a freed woman citizen in certain circles. When the decree passes, the act of freedom is quiet in its ceremony. There is no trumpeted release. There is instead a small set of signatures, a private acknowledgement, and the hush of men who understand that such gestures are both political instruments and mercies. Cassia feels in that moment a complicated collusion of relief, sorrow, and estrangement from a self she once was. Freedom does not erase the ledger she carries. It only changes its terms. With legal freedom, she makes choices that respect both her limitations and the remnant of agency she has seized. She remains close to Rufus's household for practical reasons. It is where Leodice is safely housed, where Nyssa has contacts, where the social maps that have sustained her still lie. But she also begins to accept commissions of a different sort. Consultations with governors about the customs of Pontus, introductions of musicians to patrons, translations of letters that require someone literate in both languages. The roles are modest but significant. In a city that measures women by their associations, the ability to craft those associations is power of a kind. Years fold into one another. Priscus becomes a man whose name is commonly mentioned at dinner tables. Kraus retires with honors. Rufus dies surrounded by legal documents that show a life of careful alliances. Cassia grows older in the way survivors often do. Less prone to rage, more given to precise acts of care. Her nights are still sometimes invaded by old images. The rope, the squeal of a horse, the smell of straw. Those images do not dissipate because law changed. They remain the private cost of public bargains. There comes an afternoon when Cassia, now a woman of quiet prominence in certain circles, walks with her sisters through a lesser garden that belongs to a patron's villa. Leodice walks with a posture taught in Rome, her speech a mixture of two worlds. Nyssa hums under her breath, a song that fuses melodies remembered from home with cadences learned in Roman salons. The sun falls through plane trees. A child runs by and laughs, unself-conscious and bright. For a moment the sisters are ordinary as any, and Cassia allows herself the brief, undemanding pleasure of it. They visit a small shrine, and Cassia finds herself thinking of the rituals of home, of a mother's hands mixing tea, of the sound of a particular courtyard morning, and she feels an ache like water moving behind a dam. She places a hand over the seam where she has kept the old papyrus and the ring. The seam is a relic of a life she refuses to forget. She knows she has secured what she could. A legal identity for Leodice, a public career of a kind for Nyssa, a life of relative safety. She knows, too, what the cost has been, the quiet daily erosions of dignity and the loss of a version of herself that will never return. In the later years of her life, Cassia becomes, in a limited way, a teacher. She trains young women in the arts of discreet diplomacy, how to read a patron's face, how to turn a compliment into an obligation, how to preserve a memory without being crushed by it. She speaks in private rooms to mothers who fear for their daughters in unstable provinces. She tells them the same thing she once told her sisters. Bargaining is a terrible arithmetic, and sometimes the right sum is not the one that preserves your pride. Agency, in her view, is not the heroic stand on a hill, but the patient management of what remains. It is the tiny, honest acts that preserve life and memory. Cassia does not seek monuments. Her legacy is threaded through the things she saved and the ways she taught others to survive. Leodice eventually bears children, citizens of an order different from hers, who know of a grandmother from a border province through stories that have been reshaped to fit Roman tastes. Nisa's music survives in a few fragments, sung in elite salons, then taught privately, then dispersed in ways that obscure the precise source, but carry the cadence onward. Priscus's career is recorded in the official rolls. His name appears in dispatches and memoirs that emphasize strategy and prudence. These are the scattered pieces of a life, and they matter because they are lives. Toward the end, Cassia grows ill in a way that is ordinary and unromantic. A slow weakening that leaves her less able to move through the city she helped navigate for so long. In her final days, she is attentive to small courtesies, the presence of her sisters, a favorite cup of tea warmed by a servant's careful hands, a song Nisa hums that stitches a strange comfort through ragged memories. She dies neither as martyr nor as public figure. She dies in a room where the three of them have the privacy to talk of things that matter, untouched by the political gloss that had saved and reshaped them. When the news of her death is later discussed in certain circles, men speak of an informant who aided campaigns. Some historians will record her briefly as a footnote in the dispatches of generals. Others, being kinder, will write of the complex ethics of empire and the survival strategies of the conquered. Yet the more persistent record lies in the ways her daughters, her literal sisters, and those she helped save, carry forward a mixture of memory and adaptation. The dynasty did not continue in the purest form the palace might have imagined, but its people lived, sang, married, and remembered in altered ways. We return, as we must, to the logic that began this story. Roman commanders did not always seek the immediacy of death. To leave women alive but irreparably disqualified was, in many respects, more effective. A living woman who cannot reproduce legitimate heirs or make politically binding marriages is a more permanent solution to the problem of succession than a corpse that can become a rallying point. The public spectacle of degradation, what one contemporary might call humiliation involving horses, or sexualized public degradation, was designed for psychological and dynastic effect. It aimed not merely at bodies, but at possibilities. It erased claims before they could be claimed, silenced lines before they could sing. Cassia's choice reframes that terror. She chose, in a constrained arithmetic of options, to trade a certain part of herself for the lives of those she loved. She did not become a mere passive instrument. She strategized, manipulated, and built networks. Her agency existed within limits, but it was real. A woman using the levers the system offered to preserve what she valued. The cost was not abstract. It was intimate, personal, and permanent. Perhaps the most sobering truth is that the system that offered her survival was itself designed to make such bargains necessary. Empire's instruments, patronage, adoption, household incorporation, both preserved life and remade it, converting difference into pliable forms of service. For those captured by the system, survival often demanded complicity. For those who survived, memory became the place where identity could be kept alive. Remembering Cassia means appreciating the moral ambiguity of those choices while honoring the human lives they saved. When we close this story, consider what the title claims. The fate awaiting the daughters of Rome's enemies was more terrifying than death. The phrase is brutal, but it is true in a particular sense. Death closes a ledger. It ends a narrative's capacity to be co-opted. Martyrs can become symbols for resistance, their stories sometimes inspiring defiance. What empire sought instead, through spectacle, law, and social assimilation, was a slow and bureaucratic extinction of future claims. The remaking of women into objects within Roman legal structures, the reclassification of a dynasty into a genealogy that disappears from noble memory. That is a terror that goes beyond the corporeal. It attacks possibility itself. Cassia's life does not resolve that terror for all. What she achieves is particular and small. She keeps alive two sisters, creates a pathway for their children, and teaches tactics of survival to a generation that needs them. Her sacrifice is a story that complicates neat moral categories. She is neither hero in the epic sense nor merely a victim. She is a steward of survival who navigated an order designed to erase what she loved. Remember them then, not because empire recorded them fully, but because the histories that often foreground generals and senators leave out the complex economies of survival shaped by women. Remembering Cassia and those like her is an act of reclamation, an insistence that the measures used to secure empires are also the measures that determine who lives and who is remembered. Share this story if you think history must remember those it sought to erase.